Alexander, welcome to Q Berlin. Thank you for making time for us, as I said. I'm going to start with a question that I think a lot of people might be wondering, because we've all been watching the news and seeing how the current conflict has been perhaps shifting in recent days. Is it fair to say that this counter-offensive that we're witnessing with Ukrainian forces fighting back Russian forces, is this a tipping point?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Unfortunately, not in person, but at least online. And with regard to your question, absolutely, we do believe it's a turning point. We always said that it's going to come. It would have come earlier if we had more weapons early on. We're still outgunned, but we're much more effective. We're qualitatively on a superior level relative to the Russian side, and that's why we were able to do this. And I hope that our partners will now see this and become convinced that they shouldn't hesitate any longer when it comes to weapon deliveries. Remember, we've been doing this without a single modern tank by NATO standards, right? So we were using our own Soviet tanks, some of the tanks that we received in exchange from other countries, again, of the Soviet type. And so you can see the wonders that we can do. We captured around 3,000 square kilometers in 5 days. That's about twice the size of Greater London. And that's more than the Russians managed to capture in their conquest over the last 5 months. So yes, absolutely, we feel it's a turning point and it's going to continue. Our army is highly so the morale of our army is very high. The Russian army is demoralized, and we will try to keep this momentum.
3,000 kilometers in 5 days is pretty remarkable, and you say that this does appear to be a tipping point. How do you explain it? That's another question a lot of people have been asking.
Well, with just effective planning, obviously preparation, studying the enemy, and with the effectiveness and the high quality of our troops that we've shown. It's just, superiority on the battlefield. Now, I'm no military expert to go into the details here, but we've been preparing this and we've executed on it. We knew exactly how to exploit the weak points of the Russian side, essentially, their vulnerabilities. And we've also been grateful for the support that we received. So some of the intelligence was key here, the foreign intelligence as well, the satellite imagery, but it's all together, it's many factors.
We're going to talk, of course, about the economy, the Ukrainian economy, inflation, and support in the humanitarian sense as well. But I want to ask you, you said that Ukraine can actually defeat Russia provided it receives the right support. What does that mean? What support are you talking about?
Right, so primarily militarily, because this is happening on the battlefield, so that's not a surprise. We need, as I said, more modern tanks because we are heavily outgunned. Remember, quantitatively, we are still losing. They have a lot more troops, a lot more equipment. Qualitatively, we're on a much higher level, but that's still a difficult challenge for us. So we need more weapons. Concretely, I would say we need modern tanks, especially in this phase of the war. We also need more armored vehicles. A lot of the conquest that we've just managed to undertake happened actually with a lot of our infantry quite exposed. So we have a lot of our men and essentially a lot of our troops moving around in pickup vehicles and lightly armored vehicles. And that's bad news for them. That exposes them to a lot of the risks. So we need a lot more armored vehicles. We need other military equipment, which our experts will tell our partners and have been telling our partners about. So that's one component, is obviously military. The other component is that this war is happening economically as well. So Russia is trying to, because the blitzkrieg had obviously failed, so now it's trying to stifle our economy, destroy our economy, and it's playing the long game, essentially. It's meant to be a slow, painful death. And so what we are trying to do is obviously survive, overcome these challenges, and we need economic support to do that. So especially when it comes to our budgetary needs, again, we have spoken about this many times. We have communicated this to our partners, but that doesn't mean that progress is always quick. So if we look, for example, at the 9 billion euros that have been promised to us from the Commission, the European Commission, those still haven't reached us. There have been a lot of commitments in terms of the aid, but not actually too much, or not always the transfers in time. So the US is still providing most of the actual support, economic and military, and it's not so much the EU, even though this is happening in Europe. So I would say these two things. We need, obviously, the military support, but we also need the economic support in order to function, in order to be able to conduct the war effort.
You talked about economic challenges. Can you tell us more about what those are? I mean, what is the state of the Ukrainian economy after more than 6 months of war?
Yes, absolutely. So surprisingly, it's actually quite resilient. Our economy has turned out to be quite resilient in the large scheme of things. Although, of course, we're in a deep crisis. So inflation is running at around 20 to 30%. So it's expected the central bank expects inflation to reach around 30% by year end. That's quite high, but it's actually much less than in other war episodes. If you look at World War One or World War Two, many countries had much higher inflation rates. When it comes to budget financing or just the state of our budget, so that's a problem because we're running a high deficit, about 20 to 25% of GDP, and that means around $4 to $5 billion gap per month that we're missing. And so that's being financed. The question is how we're going to finance that. And the easiest thing would have been, of course, rely as much as we can on foreign aid, which we're trying to do. But as I just mentioned, that doesn't always arrive in time. And so we are obviously trying to issue debt. So our government has been trying to, wherever they can, essentially issue bonds at exorbitantly high rates. So that's a problem. And then the final option, which is the worst, is to obviously monetize the debt. And so we have been relying to some extent on that as well. Ever since the war began, our central bank has essentially, in layman's terms, been printing money in order to finance the war effort. But that's dangerous. And that's exactly what the Russian side tries to exploit. They're hoping that, inflation will turn into hyperinflation, that we won't be able to essentially finance anything, savings will be eroded, and then the economy will collapse. And that will then mean that we can't actually continue the war effort. That's exactly the plan on the calculus on the Russian side, and we can't let that happen. So I would say, the challenges are obviously very acute. It's a very serious situation we're in, but there's also good elements, because as long as we haven't reached this ultimate catastrophe, our economy actually managed to adapt quite well. We have businesses that picked up their activities. If we look at how much lending and borrowing goes on in the financial system, then we see it's actually quite surprisingly strong. A lot of businesses come to our banks for working capital needs, for example, to take out new credit, new loans. And so that is something you probably wouldn't expect, but it's happening. So, our economy is quite resilient, and the people turn out to be quite adaptive to the situation.
We have seen how the war in Ukraine has had a serious impact on food security worldwide. How has that impact been felt in Ukraine, and what is the situation of food security there at the moment?
Yeah, so our food security is pretty much guaranteed. I mean, we obviously don't consume nearly as much grain as we produce, so we used to export that. So in this sense, this has been more of an international topic than a topic for, internal affairs or internally in Ukraine. But it is important to us because we rely on these exports normally for our revenues, obviously, and for just our GDP. And so that is, by the way, another area where we need more support. You were asking me what else does Ukraine need? So I would say we're trying to reestablish new supply routes, essentially by land or by rail. And these are going wherever they used to go by sea, but obviously the ports have been blocked. They've been unblocked a little bit, but not entirely, as we know. And so we're relying a lot on our European partners to help establish these new supply routes. But what we're seeing in recent days is that there's a lot of difficulty of getting our goods across the border. There's long queues, there's all these trails, and it seems to be that even though we've reduced trade barriers with Europe, and Europe has essentially removed all the tariffs that used to be there, there seems to be new non-tariff barriers to trade that have sprung up. And so that's something we certainly need to address in the short run.
The other side of that economic coin is, of course, Russia. And a question people have been posing here is, after several months of war, have the sanctions, the economic pressure that many Western countries have put on Russia, have they actually worked? What is your perspective on that?
Yeah, so I'm actually in the sanctions group or task force since day one. We formed a sanctions group, as soon as the war started, in order to help figure out which sanctions we need, what we can impose, work closely with our partners. So I've been quite, an integral part of that process since day one. Now it's a bigger group called the Yermak-McFall Group on Sanctions that has an international component as well. And we publish a lot, and we bring out papers and policy briefs on what should be done and what has been achieved. But to answer your question, I think that sanctions have been very effective whenever they were introduced. But the problem with sanctions is that the most effective sanctions haven't actually been introduced. So if we wanted to make sure that Russia doesn't have the financing and the capacity to continue its own war efforts, we should have been targeting the energy sector, much earlier and much more heavily. That hasn't happened, as everybody knows. I think people are now tired of all these discussions around sanctions, but that doesn't mean that the conclusions have changed. So they're expected to set in. We're hoping that an embargo will be in place sooner or later. So apparently when it comes to oil, it will be in place by the end of 2022. And hopefully with gas the same sometime down the road. But ultimately, Russia has managed so far this year at these exorbitant prices, which have obviously risen and which Russia expected, has managed to generate enough revenue to continue its war effort. So that's where sanctions have been missing, unfortunately, and where they would have been very effective in really crippling Russia's capacity to continue the war. But whenever sanctions were introduced, so for example, on the high-tech segment, they were actually very effective, and they will play out over the years. So Russia has a serious issue now producing high-tech goods. Obviously, a lot of industries have come to a complete standstill. If you look at the automotive industry, for example, that's come to an almost complete standstill in Russia. So that's bad news for them, and that does have an effect on their capacity to in the long run to operate. And other segments like the military segment, the military equipment, is also going to be hard for them to replenish and produce because they've relied on a lot of chips, semiconductors in those industries as well, which they can't source now anymore. So the fact that they can't get these intermediate imported inputs, which they used to get, means that the quality of the goods that they've been producing and the types of goods that they've used to produce are now gone. But unfortunately, it hasn't meant that the war is going to end anytime soon. I will also say that sanctions have been effective in other areas, and we should continue to expand them in those other areas. For example, when it comes to personal targeted sanctions, Russia's elites have been targeted, but it's really far and few between. We have to remember that we can't just forget about these people. These people are an integral part of the Russian regime. They're not just some independent businessmen as we used to think about them in the West. They're actually, agents of the Kremlin that have been expropriating disloyal entrepreneurs on orders of the Kremlin, that have been basically permeating the corruption internationally, again, for the Kremlin. So we need to make sure that we bring them to justice, that we dismantle the oligarchy, and that we potentially also freeze their assets and transfer them for the future recovery of Ukraine. Because there can be no other way. This is both effective if we want to reduce the long-term risks of this happening again, because I repeat, the oligarchy is a reason for why this has happened. It's not just, you can't let them say that they're victims of this. They're a reason for why this has happened. And it's also efficient and useful for us when it comes to the recovery of Ukraine.
Alexander, as we're just running out of time, I'll ask you to send one more message to our audience here, full of Germans and Europeans and people from all over the world, why it's important to continue to support Ukraine as this war continues.
Yeah, well, obviously, that's very simple to answer, but unfortunately not enough sometimes, because this is a war not just for Ukraine and for Ukraine's survival, but it's a war for the survival of civilization and European values and democratic values. If Russia is victorious this time, then this really spells bad news for the rest of Europe, for the rest of the civilized world, and for democracy in general. You will have an authoritarian regime changing the borders in the middle of Europe in the middle of the 21st century, and who knows what's going to happen afterwards. That's going to mean economic collapse or economic risks of imaginable magnitude that nobody could ever have imagined before, and obviously risks to the peace order in general.
Alexander Rodnyansky, thank you so much for joining us from Kyiv, for making time for us to join us at Q Berlin. Thank you. Have a good day. Thank you.